Housekeeping rules to all the observers: please maintain pin drop silence. Please keep your phones on silent mode, and also do not clap in between speeches. After speeches you can definitely do, and yeah, please be respectful. That being said, PM to start whenever they are ready.
Was just going as PM, shout outs as such. This is my first PM speech, so yeah, bear with me. I'll start with my speech on the count of.
No mic. No mic.
Yeah. Yes. Mic. Am I audible here?
Yeah.
Then I think let's start. I prefer taking a POI from the closing bench after a couple of minutes. To start my speech on the count of 3, 2, and 1. Firstly, to clarify this debate is not about whether people should people should follow this distinction in real life or not, but whether a distinction should practically be imposed on people in the world or not, but whether in principle such a moral distinction between doing or allowing things, whether this universal moral framework that is applicable to any person in any such situation actually exists. What we are going to prove in this debate is that doing and allowing has no distinction when you look at it from a moral lens. Morality is something that exists on a spectrum for people, and it is extremely subjective in nature. For example, it is a response to a stimulus that a person feels, and this response is conditioned by their upbringing, their education, their lived experiences of the past, and the way they think, which is unique to every single person, because every single person has had these experiences in a unique manner. For example, if you consider a family of thieves or gangsters, stealing is something that is viewed to be morally legitimate. It is not something that is viewed as morally illegitimate. But betraying a family member to the police, doing something legally right by giving up a family member, or even stealing someone's drink when you are in a family gathering or something like that, would be considered to be morally wrong within such a section of people. In other sections of people, for example, misgendering someone might be considered to be morally wrong and might be considered a moral violation, while some people may not think highly of it. What this means is that morality is extremely subjective for all people. It depends on the way they were brought up. Euthanasia is something that is a very big moral dispute. Some people believe it is right, some people believe it is wrong. There is no clear outcome. There is no single clear moral. There is no single clear moral there is no single clear moral outcome whether this is right or wrong. Morality is always subjective. Now, systemic norms and preferences, like the legal system or basically societal expectations that exist in society, also stem from the intuition of morality, but they combine the intuition of morality for a large amount of people together, and that is morphed into a framework that can be commonly applied to a large amount of people. It takes into consideration a large amount of moral viewpoints and takes the LCD of these for any society to function, right? But what this means is that morality is still something that is a priori and more important as compared to legal systems or societal expectations or societal norms, because all of these things stem from morality in and of itself, right? Again, coming to the example of euthanasia, it may be illegal in many places, but the family members of that particular person, they still view it to be morally right. Or sending parents to old age homes in India is something that is legally allowed. It is something that is considered to be legally correct, but it is still something that society morally looks down upon. So this means that there is a clear distinction between what is applicable to society at large and what morality is for people individually, right? Then coming to basically moral frameworks. Again, when we are talking about a moral framework in this debate, this means that you need it to be applicable to people universally within this debate. Otherwise, it becomes a choice that is made by people within that particular situation and not a principle which is universally applied on people. What this means is that such a moral framework therefore needs to again be an LCD, a lowest common denominator of moral frameworks of all people in the world across different situations. LCD that is commonly acceptable to a large section of society as a whole, and something that is likely to be viewed as true by most people. It is not something that will be extremely subjective. Like for example, something extremely outrageous like me murdering someone for stealing my food, or me hitting someone for just eating my food, is something that is likely to still be viewed as morally wrong, even if it might feel subjectively right to me, because that is something that in society in the least basically across society, that is something that is still likely to be viewed as morally wrong. But where morality does become subjective is where, for example, if a thief breaks into my house and in self-defense I strike that thief and something occurs, in that situation people are likely to view it differently through their own moral viewpoints. For some people who think that non-violence is the most important principle in their lives, they may consider this act to be morally inappropriate, but some people might consider it to be appropriate. And the amount of people is likely to be extremely high on both sides, and there is likely to be no consensus on this particular issue, and basically this consensus is likely to be extremely improbable. So basically this such a situation is likely to be considered to be morally okay because there is no consensus that can actually universally be attained through this LCD of moral frameworks. Before I move on, clarification.
This is not a debate about illustrations. You actually have to argue.
Yes, I am doing that. For example, like this is not. I am doing that, right? And then again, what comes in this debate is what matters more to people? Do consequences matter more to people, or do actions or the way through which these consequences are reached matter more to people? And that's what basically this debate is then about, right? Not the way the action is committed, but what result the action, what the result is. That is what stays with people. That is what people think about. That is what actually affects society and people, and basically their mental framework as a whole. That is what has an impact on people. It is not the way. Because the way you commit an action or what decision you took in that particular situation is something that is likely to stay with you for likely a month or maybe a few days after that incident has occurred. But the outcome of that particular incident is something that is likely to leave a long-lasting consequence on the world and on your life as a whole, which means that is something that continues to affect you and the world continuously, and therefore that is the only thing that matters most in this debate. That means that there is no distinction between doing something or letting something happen as long as the outcome of both things is same, because the world as a whole is impacted only by the outcomes and not through the way these things are done. And since we are talking about a moral framework, which is like whether this distinction exists in a moral framework or not, this debate cannot be about whether this should be imposed upon the world in order for the world to be a better place or not, but whether such a principle exists or not exists or not in principle, right? And therefore this is what matters the most in this debate. Now you can go around. Now opposition can argue that if you do not have a clear moral distinction between such things, people might make choices, or people might consider that whatever they are doing in such situations is morally right, even if they are doing something wrong. But like I told you, since you are taking this moral framework as a least common denominator of moral frameworks of multiple people, something that is likely to be considered outrageous or extremely wrong by a large amount of people is still likely considered to be morally inappropriate. Which means even if they choose to argue that this is about how it is going to play out in the real world, or how it affects people in the real world, on that fact, on that aspect also, we do not really on that aspect also, we do not really land into a lot of trouble, because most inappropriate actions are still likely to be considered morally inappropriate as long as a large amount of people agree on that. Which means that within this debate, they cannot just argue on whether this is this is going to how this is going to play out in the real world or not. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect.
For your stock going into the future, in where hopefully after seeing some okayish debates here, they'll be motivated to debate in other competitions going on. And lastly, thank you to the shadow, without whose support I would not be here. I'll begin in 3, 2, 1, go. First, some clarifications and characterization. Notice the nature of principles is that they obligate various kinds of actions when you have a kind of not sure about what you kind of do. Is it more important to donate to a charity? Is it more important to donate to a religious institution? Is it more important to save somebody drowning river? Is it more important to do something else? These are actions which don't directly affect your utility directly, which means you can't use utilitarian frameworks to make these actions. You use principle ones to do them. Notice then that the way principles are consistent, or way they exist or don't exist, and therefore in this debate, whether this distinction exists or not is contingent on the fact whether this idea that acts of harm, of violence, are different from allowing harm and allowing violence to occur, are internally consistent as a framework to make actions. To be consistent as a framework to make actions, only two things must be true. It is one, it must be aligned with other principles that already exist in society and other moral frameworks tell you to make different kinds of actions. But two, it must be consistent in that it must always be true no matter where you are and what you're doing at what point in time. It must always be the kind of action that you must do no matter what. The second thing of clarification is morality maybe morality itself is about perspective and subjective based on countries and populations, but principles are not. Think about it like this. In the 1800s, slavery was legal. People thought it's very cool. And they said, okay, that's nice. Doesn't mean dignity is not a principle that we uphold in society today. Therefore, you cannot judge morality and principles based on what regular or random societies or communities hold as important to themselves. Rather, principles are unique in terms of being obligated to be true for all communities, all societies, to maximize the framework through which people can mingle and exist in society together. On top of that, we think that the way that this debate exists doesn't mean we have to defend things like, oh, a robber comes into the house and suddenly like I'm letting him take all my stuff. We think we are allowed to do self-defense on our side of the house because we think that in these situations the environment obligates us to take actions to defend ourselves, to protect our interests and do all those things, because in the debate scope is actually about whether I'm actively causing harm implies I am able to influence the situation in those situations. So this debate is really more about things about vigilantism or revenge or things like preventive attacks on people who I think could hurt me or my family. And rather on our side you still get access to things like self-defense, calling the police, voting, protesting and things like that to affect change in ways which are not harmful can still exist on our side. Now, I'm going to prove the consistency of a principle to prove that this distinction exists. That is the distinction between whether acts are really different in the way that they're morally weighed compared to allowing the harm to happen. And the way we do this is by saying actively choosing to do this kind of harm is something which is significantly morally awful, first of all the time, which is the first metric to show something is consistent. Notice that the way that you're going to do harm is going to be on the best case like revenge and stuff. You decide for others what the best outcome is. Notice you do not have epistemic access to the way people think, the way they understand life, the way that they evaluate outcomes, the way they evaluate emotions, the way that they think what is right or wrong. You only know about yourself, you don't know about others, so you don't have a right to know then what is the best outcome for everybody. You are not a Laplacian demon that knows everything about everyone at any point in time, and therefore any action you take, no matter how morally motivated it is always going to be insufficient, is always going to be wrong, and will always infringe on others' ideas of what they think is moral, of what they think is important, of what they think is just. Is it fair to sort of kill somebody who your family has themselves killed, essentially in a cycle of revenge? It becomes very unclear because on both sides they feel very morally correct in doing what they're doing. Therefore it's unclear whether what you're doing is more morally correct than what is already happening, and therefore your active involvement in the situation does not make the situation any better in the first place. On top of that, we think that you're then at this point using this action as a means to an end. You want to feel better for yourself, you want to feel that you're doing something good, you want to feel important, you want to feel like a hero. For others, you want to feel that you're preserving the people that you care about from a selfish point of view. That is, I need Yasho in my life, so I will kill anybody who decides to like try to touch him even. Or I care about like Shaurya winning worlds, so therefore I will kill all his finals opponents. Like in this point of view, you necessarily for your own selfish interest to maximize your own happiness want to protect others around you. Notice at this point in time, if you take any action to harm others, to do those kinds of things, you are using and harming another person's body. That is, you are hurting them. And notice bodily autonomy is a central aspect of people's dignity, because we evolved to be able to take actions to protect ourselves, to like want to be of good health, to want to be of happiness, because this is the way that makes life meaningful, because this maximizes our survival. That means our brains evolved to care for and make bodily autonomy meaningful, to make choices, to feel happy, to be healthy. At the point where you infringe on somebody's meaningfulness of life, their ability to live life at a maximum level for your own self-interest, you are therefore using them as a means to an end to do something for yourself which is abhorrent as a moral principle in the world that exists right now. Notice then, on top of this, because you're actively taking a choice in this debate to do these kinds of things, there are multiple layers of principal harm on top of this. Because notice it's planned, which means you make various small actions. I choose at every point in time to buy a knife, to find your address, to sort of cover up evidence. These are all small micro choices that at every point in time, one, reinforce my existing moral abhorrence of using a means to an end, and therefore this scales exponential moral harm, because not just one choice to harm someone, it's 100 different small choices which I keep reinforcing and saying, I will keep doing that, and I keep doing this, and I keep agreeing with it. But on top of that, we think that you basically put multiple people through sometimes these kinds of processes, because you're not going to just randomly take up a knife and go. You make plans, you consult others, because whoever has similar interest to you, and therefore you put your moral weight of hell on other people as well when you drag them into your way of thinking and you drag them into your moral abyss. On top of that, what happens is people that other options go away at a point where you cause harm, because when you cause harm, the reaction at a point in time is other harm or other things, and necessarily the options reduce to society, because the ability to do other things like negotiate or find other solutions reduce significantly at a point where people want only the most extreme action. At a point the most extreme actions are only what's preferred. You reduce a significant number of ways to resolve conflicts, to preserve the morality of situation as well as people's dignities in this debate, and the act of reducing the ways of fixing situations the moral way itself is immoral when you reduce those things, right? Which is why it's also extremely immoral in this debate. But we think also it is self-defeating as a philosophy, because it makes often like the situation worse at a point where you then becomes kind of person who's more willing to take these kinds of actions again and again and again. What this does in this debate is it proves to you why it is always abhorrent to cause harm, even if it benefits you, even if you think it's right. It shows it's consistent with dignity dignity. The last thing I want to do is explain why it maximizes agency as well. Notice that the intuitive thought is, oh, agency is not maximized because I'm not allowed to kill people. But notice, harming others itself will reduce our agency, because then your way of thinking, psychology itself is molded, it makes it worse. Therefore, the things you can think about is less. Your options in society are less insofar police harm you, or you feel restricted to where you can go, or you might be found. At that point in time, we think it's consistent in maximizing agency itself as well, which is a broad societal principle, to have a distinction between actions, weight itself being worse than allowing it to happen. And for those reasons, you have to think the distinction exists on opening opposition.
The strategy here is really simple on OG, right? I'm supposed to prove something does not exist. You can't prove a negative. Why Ojas' speech hasn't been engaged with is that they've not understood the strategy, which is we are proving that the opposite is affirmatively true, which is your choices have direct repercussions. You are actively hedged by non-action. Non-action is in fact judged by moral principles, which therefore, if the opposite conversely being true, means that no, the allowing is very much in fact the same as doing. There isn't a distinction because you are judged by allowing. Of course, you are not going to be judged arbitrarily. You are being judged based on the outcomes that you have generated within frameworks. Therefore, Ojas' analysis as to what frameworks is and the difference between what is a moral choice or a moral framework that people subjectively apply, which is to say a gang of thieves, organized crime units, families, people in tribes, people who aren't civilized, people who are civilized, liberals, progressives, conservatives, all of those are different moral frameworks that you can apply to communities. However, are not moral principles that are universally applied. Its existence as a moral that can exist in situations does not make it a moral principle. What makes it a moral principle is that it is universally applicable. But the second and the crucial thing, right, which is why it's actually analysis and not a slimy bullshit as the clarification suggests, simple idea being that if you don't have it hinged as outcomes, if you're not going to have that idea treated with outcomes, then it's not a moral principle. It needs to be hinged with outcomes. At which point, it's only a principle when it is applied to systems universally. Everything that's from or a principle in a system comes from a moral principle. Everything that's a moral principle isn't necessarily reflected in systems. Simple push was the idea, and again, rebuilding Ojas. The idea being that things that aren't illegal or aren't immoral based on systems, you can't have actual punishments, but are still immoral. But the vestiges of that principle are always found in systems. Therefore, don't buy analysis in the air. It has to be hedged on whether or not something exists, how systems operate. Very quickly now, my quick idea on world building. No. One rebuttal. Betrayal of systems is still, and that you operate under, is still considered morally bad. Which is why Archit's analysis saying, hey, I'll kill everyone for Shaurya and Yasho, while admirable and cool, is still a principle or a moral choice that you can exist in certain situations. It's absolutely the same as the examples Ojas gave in terms of a gang of thieves and organized crime unit and all the other examples. Because it is not universally applicable everywhere, Archit's analysis is not applicable. This is not a principle. The moral principle in this front is you are betraying the systems you operate under, therefore you have to opt into the system. If I opt into the system of society, I choose not to break its laws. If I break its laws, I am violating that system, and therefore that is the greater system or principle applied, because that is universally applicable. These systems does not exclude you from saying, hey, I harmed someone far worse to protect my friend's interest. Therefore, the reason that is immoral is because that principle exists, that you are betraying the system that you operate under. You are betraying the system that gives you the benefits of not getting harmed because, hey, someone else wants to kill Archit so that someone else wins the finals, or someone else takes care of it, or someone else harms Yasho or Shaurya simply because, hey, let's deny those interests. At which point, that's where Archit's analysis fits. Before I move on to my argument, I'll take a POI. It better be an actual POI.
So, you agree that actions matter more than consequences?
Dumbass. It's talked about the idea, that's a dumbass claim, is what I was referring to, not calling you a dumbass before you get later. Actions, and this what this illustrates is, everything is judged based on a moral framework. Sure, actions and consequences have weight, but that is not to say that actions and consequences are exclusively that. Which is to say, hey, and I'll integrate this with my next point of world building. It is hinged on your locus of control. Which means, sure, you're guilty of being bad for climate change when you have multiple bottles of water. Does that mean you live in guilt saying all of climate change is my fault, glaciers melting is exclusively my fault, I need to be jailed? No, it's hinged on your relative locus of control. Which is to say, if Sid being unathletic cannot save that drowning person in the river, we're not really going to put it on Sid because, well, at least they tried, but they just couldn't because they're not athletic. Versus, and that being the hinge of locus of control. You are going to be judged by your locus of control. Are you going to be punished if you can't save someone? Probably not. Should you be judged socially if you choose actively without putting yourself in danger? You could have saved someone but you chose not to. Sure, maybe it's not illegal, but you should be judged for it. Therefore, it is a moral principle. Therefore, it is doing harm, allowing harm to exist when you are in the position to stop it, when it costs you nothing, when it is a reasonable thing for you to do, while might not be illegal based on different moral frameworks and stuff like that, is absolutely morally repugnant. And this does exist as a principle in society because as that very intuition pump suggests, you will judge that person. You will say what a shitty person. You will say that person chose to disregard a human life when they could have easily saved that person because they didn't want to dirty their Nikes or their Jordans. At which point you consider them that they are a shitty person because they prioritize that crap over the life of someone else, and you do it. At which point the affirmative or the opposite is actually true. Quick argument then. Do no harm, Hippocratic oath. There exist systems where this is true, which is to say do no harm doesn't apply to, hey, you are actively not supposed to do harm, but conversely also, you denying treatment to someone, a Catholic denying medication like say abortion generating medicine or prevention of pregnancy medication is actively a harm that is there. This is reflected in systems and cases abroad as well in terms of this uniquely being a responsibility you have as a doctor, which means it is hinged not just in arbitrary but based on your position. As your position, you had a duty to save that person. It's not just saying, hey, I'm not my patient, so not my duty. By virtue of being a doctor, you are in that position. Even if that doctor isn't in fact based on some loophole or different medical jurisdictions illegally going ahead and doing this, it is morally repugnant because your choices affect others. That's true for say fiduciary relationships, your CA, your attorney, anything like that. It looks like check your privilege conversations in privileged circles, where privileged people have the responsibility to check fellow people's privilege and abuse of privilege. It looks like feminists calling out, saying that you need to call out your boys and prevent locker room talks. All of this means in the comparative and in their side of the world, those people aren't judged. You aren't judged for climate change. You aren't judged for doing bad acts because things that aren't universally the baseline, which is symmetric on either side, are prevented. We uniquely have that benefit. You are judged. That is how change happens, which means this principle does in fact exist or does in fact not exist because the opposite does.
Perfect.
He's a very cute boy. We have had some great bedside conversations at this tournament. It's been very nice. I've had some great bedside conversations with the other VIP boys as well. Every single time I'm at a tournament, I end up hungover as fuck, and it's all yours. But it was mad fun. And I think Siddharth is here as well. I'm not sure if he is, but he's probably puking right now as well. Yeah. So, just shout out to all of them, and it was so fun doing this tournament, and shout out to the Smvit OC as well. Just keep holding these tournaments. I'm sure it will be very helpful for your DevSoc as well in the future, and it was mad fun doing this. So thank you so much. I want to fulfill 3 burdens which will help us win this debate. The first burden will explain why it's illegitimate for you to decide and wear tangible harm onto others, even if it means that you decrease some net disutility for someone else, and why this is a principle that is directly consistent with all other principles. Because the way we judge whether a principle exists or not is whether it is consistent with other principles that exist within status quo. So the first burden will prove that this is in fact consistent. The second burden will prove why consistency with other morals matter regardless of subjective experiences, and this will directly engage with opening government. Lastly, I will explain that planning harm onto others is morally abhorrent, unjustifiable, and shan't be allowed. First burden then, why it's illegitimate for you to decide and weigh up harm onto others. And there are three specific things under this. The first is that when you plan harm onto others and when you directly take that into your own hands, you are directly responsible for decreased agency for someone else because you cause active harm towards someone else. You decrease net agency of others and you restrict them from living their life to the fullest. Now you choose to decide where their agency can be decreased, where it cannot be decreased. The first thing to note here is that obviously this principle is not violated on our side of the house because you don't choose whether or not you can decrease someone else's agency. It might be happening due to independent reasons, but you don't choose it onto yourself because you don't have the moral justification for it. This is why we don't allow someone else to jail someone and put them into their own house prison even if they are a criminal, because it's not up to you, because you're not the CJS, and it's not up to you to decide the ways in which you can decrease someone else's agency. The second reason is because it's morally abhorrent for you to weigh up the suffering of others because it's not in your hand. When you do harm to prevent someone else being harmed or to prevent someone else living a disfutile life, you have to weigh up their suffering in your hands, which means you have to weigh up whether their suffering matters more or your suffering matters more. And this is obviously abhorrent for two reasons. Firstly, you can't do this, you can't justify and you can't quantify someone else's suffering because you have incomplete information. You're not privy to their lives, you do not know how they are living their lives, and hence it's important for you to not decide and weigh up the ways in which they are going to suffer. This is critical because this is also the principle that CJSs operate on. When you do want to jail someone for an increased amount of time, you do end up collecting as much evidence as possible. You want to take as much information in before you end up deciding whether or not they should be suffered or whether or not they should go in jail as a result of it. Third, you must not use people as a means to an end, and this is critical because when you weigh up suffering of others or when you directly take others' agency into your own hands, you are using people as means to an end because you decide the ways in which someone else can live their life and you decide whether they're a pawn for someone else's disutility or not. This is critical because now you decide someone else's moral agency and someone else's moral worth. This is obviously abhorrent because we as humans can't decide someone else's moral worth onto our own hands. Lastly, we do not decide everything on just net utility because that is not a moral principle we have. Net utility is not a moral principle that we live our lives with. This is the same reason why deterrence does not mean you put everyone in jail. You do not support Thanos even if he killed half the planet so that the other half could live well, because you can't decide whether you can always live life on just sheer utility. We are not utility animals. All of these principles are not violated on our side of the house because we do not weigh up the suffering of someone else. We do not decide why you should be allowed to suffer. And this is the same reason why things like vigilantism are not allowed in status quo, because vigilantism makes you decide and makes you decide whether the suffering of someone else matters more than your suffering. This is the same reason why you can't quantify the ways in which someone else suffers. Courts take time to gather evidence because they want to weigh up in the most justified manner whether someone else's suffering matters more than you. Obviously, all of this would suggest that first, our principle is not only consistent with all other principles of agency, of not taking someone else's suffering onto your own hands, or not allowing people to use others as means to an end, which is why we are consistent with all the other principles that exist within status quo. Second burden, why consistency matters with other morals and not this is not a debate about subjective experiences that OG talks about. Three things under this. First, existence of morals and principles is based on whether we consider other principles. When we say that some other principle exists, we shan't violate other moral principles. It's the same reason why you can't say a moral principle is justified when it violates other moral principles that exist within status quo. If there is a moral principle that says you should cut your hands, while other moral principle says you should preserve bodily autonomy, you obviously don't consider the first principle because it directly violates the second principle. So the first reason why you should believe that this moral principle exists within status quo is because it does not violate any of the other existing moral frameworks that we live our lives based on. And this is critical because this justifies the existence of this principle. Secondly, subjective experiences don't matter because they're far too different across the board. This is the exact reason why we don't say that subjective experiences matter while evaluating principles, because regardless of subjective experiences, we still believe that agency is invaluable. We still say that you can't weigh up suffering of others. We still say that you can't use people as means to an end. All all these principles don't depend on whether subjective experiences of others matter or not. We don't consider subjective experience when we decide whether something is a moral principle or not, and we don't consider subjective experience to decide the existence of a moral framework. Lastly, why planning harm onto others is morally abhorrent and unjustifiable, and this will explain why this is a moral principle that does exist within status quo and other people obviously also believe in. Before that, PY.
If Shaurya and I plan to kill Archit to secure his OBS and I do the killing, and Shaurya allows it, is Shaurya more moral than I am?
No, this is what I explained earlier on, that we do not have the ability to weigh up someone else's suffering, because this is the other principles that we live our life based on. Lastly, why is planning harm onto others morally unjustifiable? 3 things under this. Firstly, you plan and pray for someone's suffering. This is the exact same reason why you still arrest people for planning someone's murder. This is the same exact reason you end up arresting people who end up who end up trying to execute like big propagandas and stuff like that, because these are the same people who are planning on someone else's suffering. This is the first thing which we find morally abhorrent, because we can't plan for someone else's suffering. This is the same reason why we jail these people. Secondly, you can't justify someone else's suffering because you obviously get moral utility out of it. We obviously know that killing someone to get a better job is not justifiable because you're doing it for straight utility. This principle also allows you to believe that on their side of the house you are allowing the killing of other individuals so that someone else can benefit. This is the same reason why we don't allow things like this, because these are considered morally abhorrent, because you are allowing someone else to get utility by decreasing someone else's utility. We don't have the ability to judge how much you have decreased their utility, and hence it's not up to you to decide how much you're decreasing someone else's utility. Cool.
It is immoral for all of us in this room to allow the genocide in Gaza. Most of us have done nothing to stop this, and we have caused massive harm and allowed it to happen. We have actively chosen to allow this out of our own convenience by making the choice to not do all of these things. We support and use tech companies that actively help the IDF to go ahead and build things for our own personal gain or convenience. We don't speak out about it for fear of repercussions and how it affects our personal image. And we eat McDonald's even though it's ass, like there's just no reason to eat McDonald's, but we still go ahead and contribute to such sort of things. The point over here that I'm trying to make is we are making an active choice to do nothing to reduce the scale of harm that is happening, even though everyone knows that not engaging this would reduce the capacity of the people that are going ahead and causing harm to inflict that much amount of harm. We are actively making a choice to not engage in harm reduction, and that is something that is equally as morally reprehensible as causing the harm in and of itself. The first burden that I want to talk about over here is the burden missing at opening government in terms of why this choice being active itself means something that contributes to the immorality of this situation, and why it is equally immoral to the action in and of itself. Within this, first I want to talk about how inaction in and of itself is usually some sort of cost-benefit analysis that ends up happening in the movement. It is the sort of analysis that either it is not worth it to risk my life and safety to prevent a mugger from stealing someone, either it is not worth getting in the headache to stop someone getting abused on the street. It is not my headache to call an ambulance for someone that has fallen on the street because it might waste my time, and when I choose not to do something, I am making a calculated decision to ensure that none of the harms end up reducing. By virtue of this, I am allowing the same amount of harm to accrue as the people that contributed to the harm happening in the first place, and on that basis, there is equality in the amount of immorality that ends up happening in this situation. This also breaks down the entirety of the opening opposition case, because they give beautiful analysis on why it is immoral to not to impose harm or allow harm on someone if it is for someone else's greater benefit. The question is then, in this situation, when someone allows it, it is in their own benefit. Therefore, their own analysis on how weighing harms and weighing the benefits of not engaging in harm reduction is something that's immoral, ends up strengthening the Gov case, and they end up crossing the house. They are out of this debate. The second thing that I then want to talk about is why this moral is absolute and will take a higher burden than opening government in this. Because opening government seems to suggest that this is probably subjective and applies from situation to situation, which is probably susceptible to the claim that comes from opposition that morals are judged based on your capacity, and if you do your utmost best in your capacity and you're still not able to reduce the harm, that is still moral. We don't know why that is true, because that's in tension with their frame that this debate should purely be judged by the total amount of harm reduction that you can do, and the amount of harm reduction that you can do is linked to the amount of morality that ends up being there. The first thing I want to talk about in this case is in terms of why harm reduction is the most certain way of establishing the moral legitimacy of anything within this debate. All principles exist in some way to prevent some sort of harm within society. The principle of equality exists to ensure that we don't go around decreasing the quality of life for someone else in one way or another. The principles of things like dignity and free speech, all of these ensure that we're able to live life without causing harm to people on net. Even principles like utilitarianism are derived by the idea of creating the most good for the most number of people. All of these principles are linked in some case towards reducing harm. Therefore, the reduction of harm is the only way to ascertain whether something is moral or not. On their side, they have to defend why taking an active choice to not reduce harm is something that is slightly more moral than actually going ahead and committing the harm, even if the outcome in the harm in and of itself is the same. I want to add a few more layers to analysis to the opening opposition claims of why this sort of comparisons of harms is something that in and of itself morally egregious. The first thing is, I want to complete that this is not just that you don't have knowledge about the other person's life, therefore you cannot trade off each people's harms and sort of equate that like, oh, this is like worth it or not. Like, you cannot engage in that choice in and of itself. But secondly, the fact that while you have full knowledge about your sort of life but very little knowledge about the consequences of what might happen, or like the sorts of decisions that you might take, necessarily means that it is an incomplete choice, and in no world can you actually predict the outcomes properly of what ends up happening. Therefore, the only certain thing that you have is the ability to act to reduce the degree of harm. Notice this means anything. If you even scream while someone is hitting someone else, the fact that the attacker probably flinches and turns towards you means the person getting beat is getting hit 1 second less, which is still 1 second of harm reduction more, which is why the action of not allowing is more moral than the action of allowing. Because on the comparative, if I just stay silent and let that person get whacked, I am contributing to the same scale of harm as that person getting slapped black and blue. I am doing nothing to reduce that. I want to illustrate the POI from earlier as well. If we conspire to kill this dude so that he gets OBS, but I am the only one to pull the trigger, you would not say that Shaurya is moral. You would not say that Shaurya is innocent or legitimate for the same types of planning reasons that they talk about. In this instance, it is quite easy to believe that both of us are equally immoral, given that we are inflicting the same amount of harm, which is the loss of one human life for our personal benefit. This is the root cause of the immorality within all of this. What all of this necessarily means is, regardless of the type of situation, regardless of whether you have the capacity or not, there is always a choice for you to do something as long as you are alive. Even if you are completely restrained in all capacities, the fact is you probably still have some choice to make, and you choosing not to exercise that choice in and of itself means that more harm ends up being contributed. On the infamous trolley problem, we posit to you that the person that doesn't choose to switch the lever and allow a death, as well as the person that switches the lever to allow less deaths, are equally immoral, because both of them contribute to the same harm of death. One contributes in a way of not allowing the outcome to change. One contributes immorally in a way wherein they improperly decide which lives are more valuable than the other. Both are equally immoral, regardless of what the action therefore ends up becoming. This is the only certain thing in the debate. At least we reduce the harms, and that's the way that you run principles.
Perfect. Thank you, speaker. Please move when we are ready. Clear, clear.
Thank you, Yasho. Thank you, Himan for a really fun night. For Archit, Siddharth, Shaurya, everyone over here, fun nights, fun tournament, love being here. VIT Depsog, my ex-university, my new university, IGNU for accepting me. To the kind OC over here for organizing this lovely comp and for having a great prize pool. The only thing that is certain in this debate is that a harm happens. There are individuals that are trampled upon, people whose dignity is stripped away. The only thing that we have to prove at closing curve is that people that are witnesses to this, people that choose not to act on these things, even if you have incomplete information, are equally complicit. First, I want to break down the distasteful weighing that Sharon does. Maybe, in their best case, they are correct. Maybe it is true that people don't always have access to perfect information. Maybe people even attempt to do the right thing. Why is this still unjustified? And why do utilitarian metrics still exist? The first is because utilitarianism isn't just a broad idea about a majority succeeding and a minority suffering, but rather there are rules to utilitarianism as well. It is true, people don't always have complete information. I don't know the extent of harm that is going to happen to Archit when I kill him or when I take his prize money. I don't know the pain that everyone else will feel when this tournament ends. But the only information that I have is on myself. I know how happy I will feel. Therefore, it is immoral for me, as opening opposition says, for me to weigh my own happiness against the uncertainty of the harm that they are going to prove. But secondly, I will note that the loss of some person's happiness is a justifiable reason for you to end up doing things, because there is no social construct that ends up feeding off of my happiness and Archit's loss. If I am going to die and you can save me by amputating my leg, that's fine, because I am the person that is experiencing both the happiness and the sadness. There is no social construct that rewards individuals that are suffering, which means that sure, people in Gaza are dying. Maybe in some world that Siddharth can prove this is great for the rest of the world, but that does not take away from the loss of dignity that these individuals face. But secondly, people don't always have the capacity to make perfect choices. I think we're okay with that. Maybe I don't act in the right way. Maybe someone is drowning and maybe I freeze up and I get anxiety and I don't do anything about it. But that does not mean that I am not implicit to this harm. If it is true that utilitarianism exists and we cannot weigh off these harms, that is precisely the reason that we create rules around utilitarianism. That's why we have models that we adhere to. Rules and laws and stuff have been created for a long time, and these are the ethics that we end up establishing and sticking to. So things like, it is true that maybe you can't always help individuals, but it is still reason for you to avoid that murder to help out. I think these are the rules that we're able to persevere, and we mean that even if it doesn't adhere to perfect utilitarianism, it is still the responsibility that we bestow onto these individuals, and therefore it is their immorality if they end up doing nothing. Therefore, if we're able to prove that utilitarianism in its largest extent still means that other people have the ability to exercise other norms, like exercising their own choice, exercising their own dignity, being able to be happy, being able to be sad, living their lived experiences the way they wanted to, we're able to prove why utilitarianism and ensuring that the massive amounts of harm that do happen are independent of the harm that are faced of one individual, because you cannot take away that one individual's autonomy, and therefore consequences do end up mattering. Next, I want to prove why self-preservation itself is amoral. The first thing that I will note is, I want you to remember Yasho's analysis over here. You have perfect information on yourself. Opening government touches on this. They're like, oh, your Nike shoes and whatnot, right? But that does not complete the analysis. The analysis over here is if you have perfect choice on yourself, but you have imperfect choice and imperfect knowledge of the suffering that other individuals will face, then it is immoral for you to not do anything. It is true. Maybe I don't know the extent of harm that is happening to poverty, like people who are impoverished, and I'm not donating charity for them, but I do know that the loss that I have by having 100 rupees is marginal. Therefore, this loss should be enough for you to be forced into doing something, because only when you have perfect choices are you able to make better decisions. But secondly, the harms that occur to yourself are the only ones that you can judge. If you cannot judge their benefit, you are obliged to make sure that those harms don't happen to yourself. But secondly, I want to rebut Sharon again. The process of you not having information or restraining yourself from having perfect information is itself immoral. We judge voters that are uninformed, that don't make good choices because they end up harming other individuals. If everyone is voting right wing and we're killing immigrants on the daily, we judge individuals that voted for Trump because they're causing utilitarian prevent harms by not having perfect knowledge. Therefore, even if they're able to prove that you don't have perfect choice, the very fact that you did not get perfect information, or at least you stopped and did not attempt to do it, means that you are culpable, and therefore witnesses are equally complicit to the crime and the harm that happened to other victims, which is why this distinction does not exist. I'll take opening.
CEO takes a wrong comparative in the debate. You can interfere peacefully on either side, shout, protest, whatever. You have to actively cause planned, uninformed harm to interfere on your side.
They can knife each other if they want. I'm not stepping into that battle. I'm just proving why witnesses are equally culpable. Siddharth and you guys can question it out later on. The last thing that I want to do is rebut Archit. Archit, in his last act of love for our team, ends up making our case flawless. The only thing that they're able to ascertain is the first part of the principle, which is that a harm does happen. And we fully agree, guys. Of course, harms happen. Of course, these things should not be allowed. Vigilantism still beat people up. You guys are all correct about that. The issue with opening opposition is they never complete the analysis. They never go one step forward to prove why you, being a witness to someone killing a crime, is insufficient. So sure, maybe they're planting evidence, maybe they're planning murders. All of the capacity claims that they give do not absolve other individuals, your family members who watched you stab a random person from not doing anything. It does not matter whether or not you feel love for your family. It does not matter whether you feel love for the law. That only thing that happens, or the only thing that matters, is that a harm ends up accruing and you did not do anything in your power to stop it. Therefore, opening opposition cannot win this debate because they just don't prove why that distinction does not happen. Why, therefore, are witnesses actually complicit, and this is what wins closing government in this debate. The first is because action is possible. Opening opposition themselves concede this. But note, on the trolley problem example that Yashu gives to you, it's true that you have the ability to do something. Maybe opening opposition is correct. You can't judge whether or not one person's life matters or 5 persons' life matters or not. But if you do not know what the end outcome is, and either of those outcomes are possible, by not doing anything, you are allowing that harm to happen. Therefore, it is your responsibility to choose the utilitarian metric, to do what is in your right ethical framework, and to make sure that you yourself are at least adhering to these ethics, because all other information is untrue or improbable for you. This flips all of their mess on inaction, and it proves why witnesses do end up being culpable, because at the end of the day, a harm does happen. So sure, you can't judge individuals for not being like more valuable or less valuable, but the fact that you are a culprit means that you are like culpable and complicit within this act. You end up benefiting off of this, because if I have McDonald's, I love the utility of having a meat burger in my body, but I caused the genocide to happen over there, and therefore I am responsible for funding this. This is a direct action. But secondly, you weigh your utility over all others, and there is no way to judge these experiences. So yes, opening opposition is right, but this imposes some harm regardless, and that is the harm that you ought to debate. Prove. The last thing I want to do is just position this against opening gov. Opening gov takes a very soft stance. They are vulnerable to the examples coming from them because they have very specific scenarios about where society judges you or whether it is immoral or not. We take the harder stance. We prove why in all circumstances these ethics are universal and why utilitarianism is the way that you ought to judge the debate, because the only information that you have is on yourself and what the right ethical way for you to do is, and therefore we win this debate.
Perfect, thank you. I welcome all of the debate.
Louder, please.
It's a shout out. First shout out to Shaurya. Thank you for taking up. This was fun. Second, to Raghav, we started debating in our college, and this week we're going to graduate together. 3 years of debating with him through SLS has been immensely pleasurable. And yeah, I hope we continue to debate. We're going to be roommates in Hyderabad, so yeah, let's see how that goes. And third shout out to Ash. I think she was there at my first ever finals, and she's been there till now, and I just want to say thank you for it. Alright.
The problem with CG case is literally that they are taking the most soft stance possible. The motion reads that you are actively causing harm to prevent another harm. They cannot just run away with examples that are extremely soft. Look at the examples that Rashika gave. Trolley problem, untrue. The correct example would be, will you shoot the driver of the trolley to prevent people dying? And that's the correct what they had to defend. Probably stealing OBS. You still have to kill someone to get that OBS for you. Or probably shouting at someone to prevent someone beating up. The correct example they had to defend is that you will shoot the person who's beating up the other person. You have to cause harm, to prevent harm, that's the burden that they need to defend. What they instead defend is that inaction is better. This is also a missing burden, because not only they have to prove that inaction is better, they have to prove that by actively causing harm is less worse. All they give analysis to is saying that, inaction is better, and they push a burden upon us. I've given you already enough responses as to why they take an extremely soft cop-out stance, and they can't be credited for that. They needed to defend causing harm is important. Causing harm is okay to prevent future harm. All of Shaurya's analysis proves that why that's not okay. Let's look at the response to information. They say two things. One is that half information is okay. I'm not sure why this is okay, because if you don't know this is a 100% utile outcome, the person that you're inflicting the harm upon knows about, unless they think that this is okay, it's untrue, because then all of the analysis that Sharma gives you about autonomy is true. Because if tomorrow I wake up as an amputee and I didn't want that, and you did it to probably prevent the humanity from catastrophic disaster, I would still not be okay with it. That means you don't know it's 100% utile. The second response they give is that it's a responsibility to go out and find information. This is also untrue. My dad follows 100 WhatsApp groups that telling him that BJP is good. I think it's absolutely untrue as to why he knows or has the capacity to find the correct information in all instances possible. This means that most of their cases, one, are extremely soft, but then second, the response to information doesn't work. I think CG is entirely out. How do we weigh over opening opposition and why we win over them as well? I want to prove what opening opposition will do, and I'm going to be extremely charitable. What opening opposition does is give you two principles that are just existing. So Gov says that you probably want more utilitarianism, and opening option defends utilitarianism is bad and you want to have autonomy. They never weigh these principles. I have two metrics to weigh these principles that actually make the arguments on both Gov benches work and give you the actual weighing of how you solve this deadlock and how you prioritize one principle over the other. I think one is just irreversibility. I think this is the most proximate metric, and this weighing unlocks all of the benefits that opening option wants to run. Because one, it's important that agency is extremely proximate to you, and the idea of irreversibility is important because the suffering you put on a minority or the suffering you put on as a consequence of majority utilitarian action is extremely unique and personal to this person. This means that even if you can prevent world hunger, if you probably torture a child, this still means that the torture you inflict upon this child is irreversible in nature. You can probably solve world hunger tomorrow or other ways, but what you cause is irreversible on this child that gets tortured every day just to solve world hunger. And this is the first level of weighing that I have that solves the problem that opening option doesn't solve. The second is that the intensity of impact is much more larger to this individual person. As Shaurya explains to you, the autonomy that you face is extremely innate to this human experience. This is important because the most intense impact happened to this individual. I will prove as to why when you opt into utilitarian action, even if you want the most LCD person, LCD denominator to give max amount of happiness to max amount of people and none of them ever agree, that means for you to agree with everyone, you actually decrease the amount of max happiness. That means that the more people agree on something, the lesser the benefit they get of happiness, because people never agree on anything. Literally, there is no consensus of whether everyone in this world deserves free water. People can't agree whether people deserve free water in this world. That means for someone to agree to a utilitarian metric is extremely difficult. This means that the intensity of happiness you get is much lower to the entire world, but the intensity of harm you inflict upon this child is extremely worse because you torture this child, you kill this child, you amputate this person. This means that two levels of weighing solves what opening option does. One, on the irreversibility of impact, and then secondly, the intensity of the impact. I want to do two more things in this speech. I want to first prove that why utilitarianism unequally harms minorities. This is the extension of the impact that Sharma runs on autonomy, but then secondly, this also solves a bigger burden that opening option doesn't fulfill. Because all of the analysis that opening option gives is that, people are going to be harmed and people are going to be suffering. What are these people? Who are these people? The worst harms of utilitarianism comes to people whose happiness it doesn't get accounted for. So if you solve maximum amount of people's maximum amount of happiness, some people are sad who are never getting asked this question. These people are people who get fucked over. So if for utility, a large group of people decide that since we have upper caste and we need people to pick up our shit and throw them out, that means that the utilitarian outcome is not good. This means the worst harms of utility exist towards people who don't get asked what is utilitarian to them. And so it already proves that why you never have this information or you care about this information, you just want to maximize happiness to maximum amount of people. O doesn't do this. O just says there is suffering. Who is this suffering subjected to? Why is this suffering subjected to the worst people, and why are these always minorities who never get a say on anything? This impacts their claim, but also proves who the harm accumulates to. This looks like in multiple outcomes, torturing people, a collection of men deciding that when we go to war, women should jump into the fire because it's utile to us, because we don't want to have them be taken up by other people. This is disutile to the women, and that's a bad thing. There are multiple examples within the society of why, when you opt into utilitarian decision making, the people who you don't care about or you don't have the access towards decision making get harmed the most. I think this is important because this proves that why harm happens towards people who suffer, and why these people who suffer are important. And then secondly, why these people are disproportionately harmed.
If the suffering of one person is so bad, would you not be fine spitting on an individual to save the rest of the world?
It's absolutely disproportionate. What the fuck? I say you can't say scream, now you say spit. The correct response is, if someone is killing someone, will you take out your gun and shoot them or not? That's the burden that you have to defend. So what the fuck? Okay. The next thing I want to prove is that why utilitarianism is bad, because you are never able to agree on anything, and this is the impact that O also misses. What O says is that it's unjust. What Shaurya tells you is that it never occurs in the first place, because you are never able to get efficient decision making in a utilitarian world, because it's important. O's analysis, this I'm being extremely credible, is that this is unjust and morally unjustified towards people who don't have access and autonomy. What Shaurya explains to you is that most individuals never agree because you don't have the access or the information or the capacity to retrieve that information, because most individuals operate on different metrics of utilitarianism, and when you get that like single metric, what you do is that you probably want to get everyone to agree. When you try to get everyone to agree, you obviously trade off on like some amount of large happiness. This probably looks like nobody will agree upon universal basic income, nobody will agree on free water, people will maybe agree that people should smile all the time. That means that the net utility you get of people smiling all the time is much less than you want the actual outcome of being solving world hunger or solving world poverty, etc. etc. This also means that people have dual identities and never resolve that. We fulfill the burden on opening opposition, and that's it.
Perfect. With this, we come to the end of open grand finals of Smvit 4.0. I ask teams to cross for stage and